On a personal note, I share, as I'm sure many of you do, who work on behalf of young children and their families throughout the state. We are very appreciative of the work of Dr. Heckman, his thought leadership, his research, his ability to explain the importance of such a critical life stage in human development and resource for our state and our community. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. James Heckman.
Well, thank you very much, both for the introduction and for the opportunity to speak today on an issue that I think is of interest to everyone in the room and should be of interest to everybody in the world. And that is the question about how the most effective ways can be implemented and what the most effective ways are for boosting the skills of disadvantaged children. And you can see from the title here, I'm really going to emphasize today the importance of changing the environments and why those environments are as important as they are. So today what I want to talk about is something which is economics, and it's a lot of economics in it, but also a lot of other fields coming together. And I want to try to think about these problems that America faces and some solutions to those problems in a way that goes beyond the usual approach of focusing on one program or one aspect of society and think somewhat more globally. And so I'm going to talk globally today. If we think about the American budgetary situation today in terms of state and local federal governments, we know that the country is spending a great deal on remedial and special education. It's also spending a great deal on health, mental health, welfare costs, and crime prevention, and the criminal justice system. And so we know that generally speaking, on each of these items, expenditures are going up in real terms, and problems have been recognized, and solutions have been proposed for decades, if not centuries. But there's a question about trying to think about a more comprehensive approach to addressing these questions. And this is going to be what I call the skills-based approach. So I want to talk about, as Ted already talked about, the value of such investments. And I want to show you what the evidence is about why they pay off so well, even if we only narrowly look at dollars and cents. But I think we want to consider this more broadly. And so I want to consider questions about health and about crime and about participation in the larger society, which I think in some sense is of the greatest concern to all, how the society can function and improve its functioning. So that's what my theme is today, and I won't talk about that. So I'll just remind you of a few things which I don't think we probably need to be reminded of. But if we look at what the challenges are that are facing American society, we know, here in Indiana, but also everywhere in our society, and it's also true around the world, that there are serious issues about inequality, social mobility, a divided society, and a polarized leadership. And I think the question is always, how can we address these problems? And I want to say that there are strategies that actually can begin to address those problems. And the most effective way, and this is my theme today, the most effective way is to alleviate poverty and inequality by promoting skills and not just transferring income, not just kind of creating individuals who are somehow isolated from the rest of society. Skills are critically important, and they've become even more important in the modern world. And the question is how we can best develop those skills. Maybe the best example, and this is one that's widely cited and is a source of many op-ed pieces and have been for at least the last decade. If you look at the prices, the real wages of full-time U.S. workers, and you look, for example, at high school dropouts, you will see that over the period from the 1960s to the year 2000, real wages, or the mid-90s anyway, real wages of high school dropouts declined. Whereas if you go to the top of this diagram, you can see that the wages of people who have a bachelor's degree plus, that's the blue line, the top blue line, have really accelerated. So these are not just college graduates, but college graduates and then some. So this is one manifestation of how the labor market and the worldwide labor market has moved in a way that addresses and that really demands skill in a way that wasn't common in our thinking maybe 50, 60 years ago. So the next point is that if we look at how we do produce skills, what are the consequences and what happens? Well, first of all, by building skills and giving people capacities, giving them endowments, giving them the ability to function on their own, and giving them agency, you're giving dignity. And so that's part of this question of inequality and social mobility. Skills are the central coin of the realm in the modern economy, and building those skills will produce a society in which people engage with each other rather than kind of separate out and somehow withdraw from society. Precisely what I think we want to avoid in American society. And so I think that's something that really has to be understood. Some people in recent discussions have been arguing, well, human capital and skill-based approaches are not all that effective. But the evidence is really to the contrary. I showed you that graph showing you the power of skills in the labor market. You could look at comparable graphs in things like health, crime, and many other aspects of social functioning. And so I think that we really need to understand what effective policies are to build skills. But on top of this, I want to point out something, a strategy that sometimes has been suggested, and it's still being proposed. I mean, some of these ideas never die, even though they've been tried and they actually have failed. Some 50 years ago now, or a little more than 50, 54 years ago or so, Lyndon Johnson launched the War on Poverty. And the War on Poverty actually was a really noble effort, and many vestiges of it remain. It had a huge effect on promoting evaluation of social programs. It had a huge effect in essentially changing the social safety net available to individuals. But one component of this program was that it tried to, by giving income to the current generation, and Johnson himself said this, and many succeeded. The Nixon administration perpetuated these policies. The notion was by transferring income to individuals who were disadvantaged, literally through welfare and various other forms of welfare payments, that we would reduce inequality and promote intergenerational mobility. And by giving this generation the chance to have the resources that others had, that we could then, in the next generation, create a society of equals. And that was a noble ambition. And in fact, if you look at the Gini coefficient for the US, a measure of inequality, that we were at among the lowest level, at least in the 20th century levels. We think the Gini coefficient was very, very low about the age in the period 67 to 1969, early 70s. And in fact, income was substantially redistributed. But the question was, and this is the hope of the Great Society, the hope was that these transfers would actually build a more resilient next generation, a next generation that integrated more into society. And this graph put out by Hartley et al., a group at the University of Kentucky doing some very good work on poverty and welfare, points out something that's very disappointing. It plots the correlation, the relationship of one generation to another in welfare participation. And you can see that in the early years there was some reduction, partly because the transfers were generous. But then when we start looking at what the generational consequences were of these transfers later, into the late 70s, early 80s, into the 90s, up until the early parts of the 21st century, we can see that the intergenerational persistence is high of terms of poverty. So that the goal, the noble goal of reducing inequality, intergenerational inequality, and promoting social mobility didn't really fully succeed. And we know there have been a lot of discussions, a lot of newspaper articles about social mobility being impaired. Maybe we can discuss some of that. I think some of that discussion is not completely accurate, but I think it's generally showing that social mobility is impaired, and that this generation, young people entering the labor market, are much more likely to be facing lower real income in their lifetime prospects at age 30 and 40 than their parents did. So a significant fraction will do worse than their parents. And so what I want to suggest is the strategy of reducing inequality and promoting inclusion by promoting skills. So that takes me to the question of what and how do we, and of course, it's almost a commonplace to say this, but it's important that a skilled workforce is a flexible, adaptable, and productive workforce. So in the face of technical change, competition from abroad, when the work requirements will change, a skilled workforce is generally far more adaptable than a workforce that's narrowly trained and so forth. And so my main theme today is that a comprehensive approach to skill development is not only a wise development from the point of view of social policy in the sense of promoting inclusion, but it's also a wise policy if we just look at dollars and cents evaluation. So what's the argument? The argument is really what I've said. Modern society is based on skills, but if we look closely at what major determinants are of these skills, and this is from a broad range of research from many disciplines, that if we start seeing pronounced relationships, for example, with crime, teenage pregnancy, obesity, poor health, and so forth. And so the first message is that these skills are highly productive, not just of earnings, but they're highly determinative of success in many dimensions of social life. But the second part is something that's really not fully understood, and it's really important. It's beginning to be understood, but it's not yet understood. And that is that skills are multiple in nature. When people think about skills, I think the average person still says, thinks about some measure of cognition, like IQ. I don't know if anybody wants to hazard a guess of how much of the variability in lifetime earnings among individuals is due to variability in IQ. Does anybody want to make a guess? Just how much of variability? How important is smarts for variability in life earnings? Can I get somebody to venture a guess? What's that? 0.6, okay. Well, okay, so that would be like an R squared of 0.36. That's pretty high, you're saying, okay? Well, the answer is much more like an R squared of 0.03 in O2. And this is a point that's been out in the literature for decades. But IQ itself is a very poor predictor. And even the kind of test scores that we use to judge the success and failure of schools, like Iowa scores, ACT scores, and various other SAT scores, themselves are not that predictive. So IQ is only one part of the story, and it's not necessarily even the most important part. And of course, the world is very diverse, and many different skills are required. So what happens in this case is that many other skills, for example, the ability to show up on time, the ability to manage one's anger, manage one's own health protocols, to take medicine, to show up and persevere in school or on the job, and to deal with failure and to come back from that. These social and emotional skills turn out to be extraordinarily important even though they're not still discussed as widely as they should be. But I will point out that in recent discussions, the OECD, this countrywide organization that puts out the PISA scores that are used to rank countries in terms of educational attainment. It's the very organization, the PISA scores are the scores that rank the Shanghai public schools as being among the best in the world. Well, the OECD is now backing off from reliance on just these cognitive scores. And now the OECD is actively promoting the development of and testing and use of measures of social and emotional, or what you might also call character skills. So there's a growing awareness that these are important. California is now in its requirements for monitoring success and failure in schools is recognizing this. And a whole literature has emerged about how to measure personality, soft skills, mental and physical health. It's a very exciting research area, but it's one that actually is important because it tells us exactly what the structure is of success. It gives us the multiple dimensions that are important. So that's a message that I want to try to convey. But I also want to make this point here. When we look at these social problems that I referred to, or many others I didn't refer to, that what we know is that the fragmented solutions to these problems are not always the most effective ones. So for example, it's the case that many people say, well, if you want to reduce crime, well, hire more police and so forth. So there's a general principle that's out there in public policy. And I would put it this way, that the squeaky wheel should get the grease. If we have a problem, we know we have it and we can address it. And therefore, we don't have to guess that this is a problem. We know that there is. And so there's no problem about saying there's a problem. But the question is whether this is an efficient strategy socially. And I want to give you some evidence that suggests just the opposite. That at least for a lot of problems, especially building skills and promoting inclusion, it's a very unwise policy, that waiting until a problem appears can be much more costly, much less effective than nipping the problem in the bud early on. So let me draw on a recent paper that was published in Nature Social Science Journal, a new journal last year, and the inaugural issue. And this paper was talking about what's called the Pareto principle. And the Pareto principle is a principle that Pareto, this Swiss sociologist from the late 19th and early 20th century, enunciated, that namely that 20% of the people in the society account for about 80% of whatever results are, okay? So this was put in principle, this is put actually in practice to find out whether or not anything like Pareto's law was actually appropriate. And so what was done was a study was done, it's still being done in New Zealand. It's a so-called Dunedin study, where a population born some 40 years ago now was followed throughout their entire lifetime. So literally, it's a very intensive survey where the children, all the children and their parents over the relevant segments of their lives were followed up and really monitored to see how they succeed, how they fail. It's a fascinating study. You can actually see how people who are essentially born at more or less the same age live different lives and suffer the consequences or the benefits of a choice of lifestyle. But what I want to talk about is a finding, and that is that in this Dunedin study and in New Zealand, and this is not the Aboriginal population, so this is the population, the European population, so we're not talking about a particular group that we know might be more at risk. We're talking about New Zealanders of European extraction. And what was found was that a high-need, high-cost population, about 20%, not exactly 20%, uses more than half of all the resources in multiple social sectors. And that the other important finding was that most of these high-need, high-cost people in this segment share common risk factors that can be detected early on in life, and in particular the first decade of life. And they can be determined very accurately. So targeting early life risks is important strategies for warranting public investment. If you look, for example, at what the risk factors are at ages 3 and 5, measures of cognition, self-control, socioeconomic status, and maltreatment were very high predictors of which groups would actually fall into those categories. And so that's a sense in which we don't have to wait for the squeaky wheel or for the problem to occur, that we can actually predict who the high-risk population is and how we might go about promoting their welfare. So what I want to suggest is that the analysis, and not just this analysis from New Zealand, but from lots of other analyses, show the early onset. For example, in crime, it's known that aggressive behavior that later leads to adult criminal behavior, very aggressive behavior, more or less manifests itself around ages 3 and 4. And in fact, one of the programs I'm talking about today is actually a very effective program precisely because it starts around those ages and essentially nips this kind of crime impulse and lack of self-control and inability to interact with others in the bud early on. And so what I want to argue is that we can use this knowledge in a constructive way to create flourishing lives. And that's really the theme of what I'm saying. So that's the first point. But I think when we think very hard about this, we have to really understand something that doesn't get talked about as much as it should. This is common sense. And I think anybody, any parent in the room, any observer of parents in the room would argue, would agree with this. But yet public policy does not really act on it. Namely that families and not schools are the major producers of the skills of children. So when we think about traditionally producing skills, most people think about sending a kid to, say, an elementary school or a high school or maybe college, and not understanding the important central role of the family in producing those skills. And I think what we have to understand is that the importance of the early years, and the early years where the child is mostly influenced by the parents and the environments that the parents choose for the child, or the environments the parents are living in. And so when we really understand the importance of skill formation, we really understand that skills beget skills, and this process starts at an early age. It actually starts in the womb if the mother is not taking adequate protections. So I think the strategy for making an effective policy is to help troubled American families to develop the skills of their children. And I would emphasize another component. Yes, families are in trouble. And there are many, and I'll show you a few dimensions, so I think you're familiar with a lot of these problems, much discussed. But the question also is to approach the family in a way that it gets the cooperation of the family. And so help troubled American families through voluntary programs, programs that work with the families, respect their values, and at the same time respect and enhance the ability of the family to encourage the children. So what I want to talk about is policies, and most all effective early childhood policies, in one way or another, support families in engaging and nurturing their children. And I think that's the key to success in education and learning at all stages of a child's life. So I think this is a very important theme, and I'll give you some evidence on this. So why do I think the family is so important? People don't like to talk about the family, but if you ask the very simple economic question, what are the sources of rising inequality in society? So this is a figure that was put out recently fairly recently by Jeff Larimore and his co-authors. And what they're looking at is the study of inequality in family income across the U.S., something that's definitely been very well documented. So between the late 70s and around early 2010, there's later data, but this figure is particularly easy to use, and I'll just use it today. that we can say, okay, what's the Gini coefficient, this measure of income inequality among families? By the way, Mexico's Gini inequality is about 0.46, and we're about 0.4 in the US these days. And you ask, what accounts for the growth in this? A major factor for the growth is basically household structure. We know that there's been a growth in single-parent families, and that single-parent families provide fewer resources for the individuals in those families, not only for the parents themselves, but for the children. If we also look at what has been a growth factor, male employment has been a contributing factor, not so much. Men's earnings disparity, what I was showing you before, the graph about the wage differentials, that accounts for about 73%. Women employment, as women's employment has increased, that's reduced inequality. And disparity, however, among women for different skill groups, there's a version of the same disparity between male skill groups as there is for females. And also assortative mating. The more educated people are marrying each other and the family structures become more stratified. And so literally we do see America is coming apart. There's a book by Murray, actually, with exactly that title, which I think is highly relevant to the current discussions. We are getting two societies. And of course, I think, when we understand how important this is, we know that the family is a cornerstone of effective skill development. But the family life is under stress. So let me give you one statistic. So these challenges, by the way, really impair the children. And I think this has got to be a central question. So this graph I've used repeatedly, but I think it's very, very important. Because this growth of single-parent families in the last 25, 30 years, it's a fact. I'm not suggesting we reverse the fact. I'm just suggesting we realize the fact. And we develop policies that recognize this fact. And so if we look, for example, at the growth of the number of children under 18 living in single-parent families, you can see that there's been a big growth, close to 30% now in 2016. And if you look, for example, the biggest growth sector is in families where there was never marriage by the mother. And these are the families that are exactly major contributors to the growth and inequality in society, and exactly the families where the resources are the least available for child development. Not only monetary resources, but also time and education resources, the kind of advantage that more educated parents give. We know that single parenting is typically found much more among lesser educated women. And so that's a huge issue, a huge issue. So what do we know about this? And this is, again, an iconic table done some 20 years ago. But if we look at the nature of the family structure, exactly the kind of verbal environments and the kind of parenting environments that these children are facing, you can see, and this is where the so-called 30 million word gap is just multiplying this up over 5 years. But what you can see is that the actual verbal environments differ hour by hour of children across different social classes. And the nature of the parenting changes from discouraging to encouraging. So there are two aspects of this. It's the nature of the parenting strategies used and the nature of the verbal environments heard. So this by itself is a huge measure of inequality on family life. And of course, if we look, for example, at the growth of expenditures by family life, we look, for example, at the top income quintile, we can see that the amount of per capita expenditure on children, it's growing rapidly among the top quintile, the top 20% or so of the income family income distribution. And it's more or less, it's increasing at the bottom, but at the top has gotten a lot more of the gains in income, and the society is separating out. So not only are there parents separating from other parents without the same education and without the same advantages, but the children, that disadvantage at a point in time is going to be transmitted to the children at a later stage. And again, a piece that, again, it's an old figure, but a figure that's very valuable. Namely, if we look at achievement test scores, suppose we just ignore what I said a minute ago and look only at achievement test scores so we talk about the college readiness gap at age 18 between children whose mothers are high school dropouts versus those who have college graduate mothers. You see a sharp difference at 18. That's the achievement gap that many people talk about. But it's there at age 8, it's there at age 5, and it's more or less there at age 3, which is about the earliest age we can accurately measure it. So we can see that these emergence of these gaps is real, and it is something that should be understood in shaping public policy. So if we ask, what are the effective strategies? What might we do in an effective way? I want to argue that early childhood programs substantially reduce achievement gaps and produce outcomes. And essentially, and this is something that I think really has to be understood, the most effective ones work with and encourage the parents. They engage the parents. But we also, in assessing which ones are effective programs and which programs are ineffective, I think we have to be very careful in picking which programs, which measures of IQ are which measures of performance we use. And this comes right back to the measurement issue I was talking about earlier. Now there's an early experiment that was done a little bit before the time of Lyndon Johnson's Head Start initiative, but about the same time. Up in Michigan, in Ypsilanti, Michigan, a group decided to intervene early in the lives of children. And this was in the 1960s, when people thought that the central message, the central product of education and educational investment was boosting IQ. And so the focus early on was a boost in IQ. And if you read the early years of the Perry preschool program, the early news accounts, everybody was very excited by this. So this was the kind of graph that really made a lot of people very excited. In the early years of the program, the treatment group, and these kids got 2 hours of intervention a day, 5 days a week, and there were home visits kind of stimulating the parents. In the early days, there's a huge burst in IQ for the treatment group relative to the control. And this led to tremendous enthusiasm about the program. Why? Because people thought IQ was the major factor of determining life success, even though, as I told you, it's a fairly minor factor, but that was discovered much later. If we look, for example, at what happened, though, in the program, that there was fade out. And so by age 10, these kids are no smarter. And something comparable happened in the Head Start evaluation, even at an earlier age. And this is what led Arthur Jensen and the whole discussion about inferiority of certain groups and so forth, to argue that, you know, basically there was nothing we could do for disadvantaged children. But I think the key lesson that came from understanding the Perry study, and something we've come to understand, is that when we followed these Perry people, and I followed them now till age 55, I've gotten in the act now, we have latest data. If we look, despite this IQ fade out, if we look at the annual rate of return on a dollar spent on the Perry preschool program, one's getting a 7 to 10% per annum rate of return, a very, very high rate of return. So what's the source of this? Well, it worked primarily through boosting social and emotional skills, which were measured more or less as a byproduct and not as the main focus. And so just as Jensen's message was incorrect in the sense that Jensen was focusing only on IQ rather than the full range of life skills that are important, what we really came to understand is these social and emotional skills, which were once basically considered too soft. They're called soft skills for that reason. They can't be measured. Well, that's not true. We know that they're important, and we have very hard evidence on soft skills and ways to measure them. There's a lot of very exciting work we could talk about. So we understand now, major advances have occurred in understanding which skills are important for success in life. Cognitive ability is important, yes, but it's these other social and emotional skills, and here I give you a list. These are, as I say, sometimes called character skills, but the ability to kind of self-regulate, and to be motivated and to hold oneself in regard, defer gratification, and the like. So I think what we really need to do in our work and think about this is to think about how we might foster these skills. What is the appropriate way? What are the mechanisms? And what I want to argue is that we want to develop cognition and character from conception, from birth through life. So what are the effective strategies for doing this? Okay? First of all, we have to recognize something that is not fully appreciated yet, even though there's a large body of evidence supporting it. That both the social and emotional traits and cognition, even IQ, they're skills. And by skills, I mean they're things that can be acquired, things that we know they can acquire. We can boost IQ if we start early enough. We know that we can foster these skills. And so developing these multiple skills is going to be the most effective way. So what do we know about those strategies? I talked about the Perry preschool program. Perry children are now 55 years old. And now they have had children, and many of those children are adult children. And so if we look at the Perry children, we have a very high rate of return, which I talked about a minute ago. But if you look at the intergenerational effects, what you can see is that not only are the children, the original Perry participants, better off than those who didn't participate, but the children of the children are better off. And it's that second generation effect. So it creates this multiplier across generations and truly promotes social mobility in a way that the cash transfer strategy never did and probably never will unless it's gripped. There's another program which is actually even more focused starting earlier in life. This one boosts IQ. It starts at age 8 weeks of life. The ABCDarian program, which is a prototype for a lot of modern policies, Educare and the like, it shows healthy benefits from a very comprehensive approach. And it boosts IQ. And if we look at the outcomes, it's improved parenting practices and child attachment, positive effects on behavior, health, educational attainment, employment, reduced criminal activity, and the like. And so this figure, which is published in Science a few years ago, is an example of something that really startled many people in early childhood development. It certainly startled people who are used to thinking about IQ or test scores as the measure of a program. And what it shows is that if we just look at age 35 measurements of treatments versus controls, we can see blood pressure for the treatment group is much lower, both systolic and diastolic, less hypertension, less metabolic syndrome as a precursor for diabetes and the like. So the health benefits were there. And how did they arrive? Well, it wasn't just through a boost in IQ. It did promote education, did promote awareness, but it also promoted self-control. And in this way, we see multiple benefits. And so if we look at all of these benefits and put them together across crime, health, and so forth, you get rates of return for the overall program that are approaching 14% per annum. It's richer than Perry, partially because it's starting earlier, but it's also, we have a larger inventory that we assess, and we see substantial effects on health. And I should also point out that one of the components of this rate of return is something that frequently gets neglected. Namely, this ABC program was not 2 hours a day like the Perry program, but it was more like 8 hours a day, which provided childcare for the women. And so one of the components of the rate of return was actually the increased earnings and the increased education of the mothers of the disadvantaged children who were able to return to school, were able to get jobs, and therefore enrich the family life of their children. So not only did this, we actually found that the enhanced income of mothers from providing childcare by itself would pay for the program costs. So this is where we're starting to put things together to understand various programs. So what's the mechanism? I'm running out of time. I want to have some time for questions and answers. But what are the mechanisms? And a persistent finding in all of successful programs a persistent finding, is exactly that you're changing the nature of the parent-child relationship. And what that does, it goes way outside what happens ordinarily in a, say, a 2-hour preschool class or even an 8-hour ABC class. What it does is it creates an environment in the home which induces preferences, beliefs, and skills of the parent. Very substantially studied. So it creates then it creates an environment. And then it feeds in to this dynamic skill formation process. So we have social and emotional skills feeding into cognitive skills. Healthier children can learn more and actually acquire and concentrate better. Cognitive skills produce better health practices. It's this synergy and this dynamic synergy where we found that the early years are the most productive precisely because the children are highly malleable, they're flexible. And so this gives rise to a curve which has been documented. This is a thought experiment, but it's been borne out in many ways in studies around the world, not just in the US. And so we ask, where, if we start at the beginning of life, do we have the highest rate of return on investment in human capital? The highest rates of return would be in the prenatal years. We know that fetal alcohol syndrome, serious damage to the fetus in early age, can lead to life-threatening difficulties. And I'm not saying there aren't high returns to job training and schooling. The previous diagram that I was showing talks about this synergy, so that if we build the base early, it makes it possible to gain all the benefits throughout later life. So the rate of return to college education for a highly motivated, smart child can be as high as 23% per annum. College, ordinary 4-year college. But you need the base in order to be able to take this. So all this graph is saying is that a base early on provides opportunities to benefit from all of what happens later. And so all of what life offers all along. And that's the logic of the structure of these programs. So I think what we see is substantial returns on high-quality programs for disadvantaged children. And I think the theme really has to be, people talk about universal versus disadvantage. I think the evidence is overwhelming that the most effective programs are those that are targeting disadvantaged children. And those disadvantaged children are the ones that have to be. So, have to be targeted. If you want to make rates of return, advantaged children are getting good home environments, and frankly, it's maybe better home environments than any public program could provide. And what any public program that's going to be successful is going to do is help improve the family environments, to help improve the parenting skills of those children. So what I want to argue is that successful early childhood programs help the parents grow their parenting skills, foster their skills and the aspirations of their children. And so it works in an inclusive way in the sense of providing those resources, recognizing the change in American society, recognizing that a lot of children are growing up in homes where the advantages are not there, and that really need attention. But giving that attention in a way that is not talking down to people, that's not condescending, it's on their terms, and yet at the same time, it's effective in igniting this parent-child interaction. As I said, virtually all successful programs that I've studied have always had the effect of improving the parent. How do they do it? And they don't even have to have home visits necessarily. If the child comes home highly motivated, curious, anxious to learn, the parents typically engage. And so home interventions directly can be effective, can be very cost effective. But the fact of the matter is that somehow we have to recognize that families, skills matter, families are important creators of skills, and that we need to supplement the American family, help the American family. So thank you very much for your attention. Yes,
Do we
please.
have questions from the audience? We have a microphone posed here for any questions that are in the audience. You covered it so thoroughly.
Put everybody to sleep. Oh, here, yes.
All right, okay, thank you. Thank you for coming today, Dr. Heckman. My name's AJ. So my question is if you could write a bill or make a policy on a national level that could help solve some of the problems that you outlined during your speech, would there be something that you would do, or does it need to come from more of a socio-cultural level, like in the homes or in the communities?
Well, I think there has to be an awareness, and we know there's an issue about awareness, that there are groups of people, it's been tested by anthropologists, by developmental psychologists, and by economists now, more recently, showing that many parents will not have reasonable expectations about what a growth trajectory would be for their child. What their child, what would be sort of normal standards. And even telling the parents what normal standards, what to expect, and what's productive in helping the child. Informing them of that, not telling them they have to do anything, but working with them. That giving that kind of information is very powerful and effective. Now, I don't know if you want to, I don't think we want to have a constitutional amendment, you must read to your child three hours a day or something. I think what we want to do is recognize in social policy a much broader portfolio of solutions, and to recognize the interconnected nature of these problems. And so a practical suggestion would be, for example, think about government agencies. Most states have a Department of Education, a Department of Human Services, if you will, household matters, family services, and then maybe a department on criminal justice, or somehow interested in fighting crime and providing law and order. Well, those cabinet agencies are generally looking at going downstream in the life of a person and tackling problems as they occur. What I'm suggesting is at least integrating the tasks of those agencies, understanding that building these basic skills has a tremendous advantage in solving this whole range of problems. So part of it's an awareness campaign. Surprising, I think some of this is completely obvious, but it's not obvious still in public policy. Some of us were talking about this at lunch. People are still thinking that, for example, social and emotional skills are just too soft and fuzzy, they can't be measured. They can be measured. They can be measured with administrative data. You don't even need questionnaires. There are ways to essentially encapsulate those skills and guide teachers and parents about their child's success. So I think part of it is education. Now, I'm an educator, so naturally I'm going to say we need to educate people, but I think it's true that there really is need for dialogue. And I would say that in other areas, I find it very depressing myself. The recent paper by Chetty that got featured in the New York Times really, I think, did the U.S. a disservice. It was truly, it wasn't him, it was the New York Times editorial staff. They really misrepresented what the study showed. I discussed the study. You can see my discussion, and I have a video at Princeton when I discussed this a few months ago. And what the study really shows is the power of the family, even though that was denied by the accounts. And it shows that the fact that social mobility really has gone up for a lot of groups in American society, but it also has kind of ignored some really central issues about intergenerational mobility. So, for example, in looking at what seems to be, and was featured in the New York Times editorial, that there was a lot of racism directed predominantly against black men, what it also failed to understand and even estimate that it wasn't in the data was this intergenerational link of family. We know that if the father's been arrested, and we know that for many reasons that have been talked about in the public policy, family environments among the African American community have been compromised in part because of the drug arrests in the 1980s. A lot of the parents are in prison or have prison records. And we know that the probability that the child, if the father is arrested, that the son is arrested rises by 25%. That's a fact. Those environments. Why? Because of the resources given to the family, lots of reasons. So you really kind of minimize the role of the family and policies focusing on the family, and instead focused on other factors that I think were not constructive. They weren't constructive because there was no policy action. If you don't believe me, and please, you can read, you can see my tape. I'll be happy to give you my exchange. I'm interacting with Chetty himself, asking him what were the policy implications of his study, and he said none. And it's not true. But if the study is correctly interpreted, we can see the importance of family life. So there, I would say, changing the national dialogue, even on race, for example, I think is important. And so we know, I mean, I'm talking about a hot button issue, race, and maybe one shouldn't talk about it. I think that when we understand families matter, and it's not just the African American family that's been under stress, it's many other ethnic groups as well. Understanding the importance of the family and understanding how we might supplement the family has implications across the racial spectrum. And so it takes issues that are now being considered racial issues or issues just of criminal justice or just of education, and puts this into a deeper, more comprehensive study where we understand where we're at and what we might do about it. So I would say, it's not answering your question. You want me to give you a bill, Senate bill number 2301 or something. I don't have that. I think that would be foolish, but I think what needs to be done is put these pieces together. I mentioned childcare, I mentioned child development, I mentioned family policy. Those three things are frequently treated separately. I mean, even in the 2016 election, when Hillary Clinton, for example, was talking about child development, as she has in many, many years promoted child development, she didn't link it as forcefully as I thought she could with child care. I mean, the child care issue and the child development issues are inextricably measured. And family policy. Many people don't want to go near family policy. And it's become almost taboo to talk about it. But it's a reality. And every study that I've ever seen, and studies that are very, very honest and reporting their limitations, nonetheless show the power of the family, which I think just about everybody in this room would admit to, that the family is powerful. So I think that's what I would talk about is trying, I guess now, I feel some concern that we can't, if we don't honestly talk about these problems, we won't ever solve these problems. They will always go unfettered. So back in the 1960s, I think you could forgive Lyndon Johnson for thinking that increasing the welfare of one generation by income transfers was a good idea. Nobody knew. I mean, we didn't have much social science evidence on this. So we have 50 years of that. Pure income transfers have various consequences. They didn't promote social mobility, which is a sorrowful outcome. So we have to think of a skills-based strategy, and I think that's where I would try to integrate that, but beat that into the head. So I would, if I had to make a constitutional amendment, as I would say, think of the skills in the family and think about things more comprehensively rather than one vote at a time, one budget item at a time, one cabinet agency at a time. I think that's really the theme of what I'm saying. Yeah. Oops.
Dr. Heckman, you mentioned social-emotional skills, you mentioned character. Have you seen any research that's focused specifically on empathy, how it's best developed and the impact it has on a child and those around them?
Well, empathy, I mean, I have a colleague at the University of Chicago named Jean-Paul Dessity, and he has students, one of whom worked for me. She's now at the University of California in Riverside. So people have measured empathy and have seen the consequences, the neuroscientific traces. But yes, in some studies that have been done with mentoring programs, for example, so I will broaden the notion of empathy to include some notion of altruism or concern for others, that there are programs that involve mentoring, where children are basically given instructions, not instructions, but are just talked about. They're explained. These are adolescents now. These are not early childhood programs, but there are versions for early childhood. I know those less well. But I do know that these children who are basically coached in what you might think of as common character traits, saying, thinking about the feelings and concerns of others and giving examples of where that benefits and can be useful. There have been evidence that in ways that are elicited in laboratories, you can see whether children are more altruistic or more likely to help others. You can actually see that these training programs, these mentoring programs, these parenting programs that are essentially teaching children how to engage each other and the value of that engagement have had effects. So you can see. Now the question is, how long are the effects measured? How long do they last? And so far it's only a few years. But in principle, one can. But see, one thing that came out of Perry, although Perry didn't specifically focus on mentoring for empathy alone, but what came out was a range of behaviors that were generally very favorable. So, for example, much less propensity, say, to commit crime, and much less propensity to commit aggression at an early age. And so those aspects of self-control were consequences. And if you look closely at the curriculum, you say, what did they do? Well, these kids came in every day, they planned a project, they executed a project, individual project, then they judged the projects collectively. They worked together and they worked separately. And they stayed together in the room, week by week, day by day, and they developed then those kinds of skills that come from group cooperation and from understanding also how to restrain themselves and how to motivate themselves to finish tasks. So, go back to the model of the middle-class mother telling the kid, you can do this, stay with the task, and so forth. A lot of kids don't have that. And so I would argue empathy and a set of other skills have been measured and have been achieved by these programs. A program that specifically focuses on empathy, I don't know, but I could look it up. I think there have been. There's one program in Germany called Baloo and Do by Armin Falk. I can send you that if you want. I can send you the program. And that does actually promote this moral behavior anyway, promoting altruism. And there are other interventions along those lines, trying to suggest how people might, relate to each other and the values that come from that. So I think we can foster those. That used to be, if you look at the history of American education, that used to be a central focus of American education. And it's an interesting history about how that got eliminated from the curriculum. And I think it got eliminated from the curriculum partly because the early curriculum was more or less patterned after the Protestant Bible, and so there were people pushing back against that, against religion. And so morality and religion somehow were bundled together, but they don't have to be. They can be successful, but you could separate that. So the McGuffey's readers, even from the late 19th century, did have fables of morality along with stories. So, the tortoise and the hare, the Aesop fables kinds of stories, and stories about how little, bad children were punished and good children were rewarded. I mean, those kinds of stories got progressively eliminated from what we thought of as education. But still, there's been a current in education. John Dewey and certainly Horace Mann before him. There were plenty of educators who saw this as a central function of the education system. I think that's beginning to return. And whether or not it has to be bundled with religion is, I understand, for some people, a very, very controversial subject. And it's not obvious you have to. There could be moral education, maybe without religion, maybe not, maybe so. Big debates on that, I know that. But I do think that the structure is such that it can be taught. at least aspects of this can be taught. But of course, the best teaching of this is by example. So actually, parents do set an example, and in some of the preschools and child care centers, those examples can also be set. So.